You know, when a god drops dead over your city, the first thing you feel isn't fear. It's a bizarre, almost laughable disappointment at just how loud they thud against the ground. This behemoth, the size of half of Australia, simply tumbled out of the stratosphere, crushing our vaunted orbital docks like empty beer cans and slamming into the oceanic shelf so hard that a tsunami circled the planet 3 times. We were all used to looking up with reverence, because the watchers were like eternal guardians to us, silent shadows on the edge of our telescopes who supposedly protected our peace with their technological superiority. And there I was, an ordinary military engineer with a questionable talent for xenolinguistics, standing in the drop bay and staring at the mangled hull of this celestial Olympus, realizing that our heavenly daddies had just officially filed for bankruptcy, and in the most brutal way possible. Inside the ship, everything looked as if someone had turned the laws of physics inside out and forgotten to put them back. I made my way through vast halls bathed in a dim blue glow, where gravity constantly shifted directions, feeling like an ant in the bowels of a broken supercomputer. Debris of crystalline hardware lay everywhere, and the air smelled of ozone and some kind of fermented perfume. But the strangest thing was something else. There were no signs of a fight, no projectile hits or thermal burns. The ship was 90% intact, aside from the impact damage, yet it was absolutely dead. My boots clattered hollowly against transparent panels under which flows of frozen energy ran, and in that ringing silence, I began to realize that the greatest creation in the universe had turned into the largest mass grave humanity had ever seen in its entire history. When we reached the central bridge, I expected to see Titan heroes who had died valiantly, but the reality was far more foul and shocking. These beings, whom we considered perfect, lay in their cradle seats in postures that were anything but majestic. They were curled in the fetal position, covering their heads with all their limbs like small children, hoping that if they just close their eyes, the monster in the closet will go away. Performing an express analysis of their neural nodes, I realized with horror that their hearts had stopped simultaneously due to an overwhelming surge of stress neurotransmitters. They didn't die from an explosion or a virus. They simply went collectively insane from terror after seeing something in the abyss of space that paralyzed their will and caused their advanced brains to just shut down. These gods were so desperate to hide from someone that their own fear became their death sentence, and the sight of their contorted bodies filled me with both pity and a wild, primal cold in my chest. For dessert, I dug into their main archive, hoping to find some logical explanation for this mass hysteria, and stumbled upon a working terminal with the last recorded log. The translation took only a few minutes because their language became unexpectedly simple in moments of agony, and what I read overturned my understanding of our place in the world once and for all. It turned out that the Watchers were never our teachers or protectors. They were calculating farmers who intentionally seeded worlds like ours to create as much biological noise as possible. We weren't their beloved children. We were mere flare traps, living shields meant to burn bright and loud to distract the attention of something truly hungry coming from the deep void. Now that their capital ship lay in ruins and the camouflage was stripped away, I realized our time in the role of the ignorant was over. And now we would have to either become very mean or just wait for those who even the gods feared to come for us. I sat before the flickering control panel, my fingers trembling from cold and exhaustion as I tried to break through the encrypted layers of the fallen behemoth's onboard intelligence. When the interface finally gave way and spat out a stream of data, what unfolded before me wasn't the history of a great civilization, but some twisted ledger for tracking livestock. The Watcher's AI didn't greet us as heirs. It dryly stated that our sector of space had been intentionally sown with organics billions of years ago for one single purpose. All our development, all our wars, cathedrals, and technological breakthroughs were merely a means to increase the intensity of the so-called biological noise we emitted into the void. I looked at the graphs of our evolution and understood that to these beings, we were nothing more than bright light bulbs they had screwed into the darkness to keep themselves safe, while we burned out in full view of the entire universe. When the full realization of the term heat flare hit me, I wanted to laugh hysterically right in the faces of these dead titans frozen in their chairs. It turned out that from deep intergalactic space, something called the Harvest is moving toward us. Beings of dark matter that react to surges of collective consciousness and the energy of developing races. The Watchers, those cowardly super-gods, simply used us as live bait, setting up hundreds of farms like Earth across the galaxy so that predators would lung at our bright light while the masters themselves hid in the deep shadows. We weren't children or even test subjects to them, but ordinary expendable material created to die first to give their creators an extra million years of silence and peace in their dark sanctuaries. The text of the final message I fished out from the depths of the system literally dripped with cold arrogance and absolute indifference toward our fate. It stated that our solar system was originally chosen for its convenience in broadcasting our noise into the sectors from which the enemy's arrival was expected. The Watchers proudly described how they nudged our primitive instincts, forcing us to fight and breed so that our radio waves and psychic activity would create as much interference as possible for the Harvest's radars. Every great empire in our history, every scientific revolution was just a way to make our light bulb even brighter, to draw the monster's attention specifically to us. In that moment, I felt a rage I had never experienced in my life. We were raised like pigs for the slaughter, carefully monitored to ensure we were loud and appetizing enough for those coming from the dark. At the very end of the recording, I stumbled upon a protocol that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and a distinct taste of copper filled my mouth. It turned out that the crash of this ship wasn't an accident, but the result of panic when the Watchers' camouflage began to fail under the pressure of the approaching shadow. Now that their umbrella made of our short lives had stopped working, they simply decided to toss us aside like a gnawed bone, hoping the Harvest would gorge itself on humanity and a couple of dozen other junior races before moving on. I sat in that dead silence of the bridge and realized that we were now on our own, abandoned by our creators into the clutches of unimaginable horror. But deep within that rage, a strange, almost insane thought was born. If we were created to make noise, then we are going to make a racket that will make this whole damned universe shudder. When the fallen flagship systems finally switched to emergency mode, the sky above our heads turned into some nightmare attraction that made you want to gouge your own eyes out. I stood on the crumbling hull of the ship and looked up, where the familiar constellations began to vanish one by one, as if an unseen hand were blowing out candles on a giant birthday cake. This wasn't the normal fading of stars. It looked as if the darkness itself had gained density and begun to methodically suck the light out of space, leaving behind only dead, icy caverns. The Harvest sensed the breach in our camouflage almost instantly, and now these dark matter creatures began feasting on the energy of entire systems, moving toward us with terrifying speed. That night, I realized our cozy little world was just a fragile bubble that had burst, leaving us out in the cold before an infinite and hungry something that knows no mercy. But the true horror didn't come from deep space. It came from the depths of the very systems we considered our divine patrons. The surviving Watchers, hiding in secret enclaves across the galaxy, fell into true madness upon realizing that their living shield in the form of humanity no longer worked. Instead of helping us, or at least giving us a chance at survival, they activated the Silence Protocol, a program of total cleansing of all junior species to erase any trace of their presence. I watched through the terminals as automatic executioner satellites, which had slumbered for millions of years waiting for this gruesome order, began to wake up in the orbits of neighboring colonies. These arrogant creatures decided to simply burn us away like old dry grass, hoping that if absolute silence fell over the universe, the harvest would pass by their hiding holes without noticing the master's presence. I felt a cold, calculating rage boiling inside me as I read the algorithms of this extermination, where our lives were equated to a statistical error. Protocol silence didn't just imply murder, but the total dissolution of matter, so that even the atoms of our bodies couldn't give off a heat signature in the infrared spectrum of the void. These beings we worshipped were planning to turn flourishing worlds into sterile chunks of rock in a matter of hours, just to save their own precious skins for another couple of centuries. I looked at the holograms where red dots erased entire continents on distant outposts, and I realized that to the Watchers, we had always been nothing more than radio static that had now become too dangerous. We were being betrayed on such a fundamental level that the very idea of divine providence turned into a sick joke written in the blood of billions of innocent beings. At the moment, the first beam of the orbital cleanser struck the ocean surface, vaporizing cubic kilometers of water in the blink of an eye. I made the most important decision of my life. If these cowardly gods thought we would just humbly drop to our knees and allow ourselves to be erased for the sake of their peaceful sleep, they were deeply mistaken in their assessment of human stubbornness. I began intercepting command frequencies, hammering into the system the access codes I'd managed to rip from the flagship's memory, trying to turn the instruments of our execution into our only weapon. We were created to make noise, and I was going to make that noise so deafening that it would tear to shreds both the Watchers' protocols and the sheer arrogance of those who considered us fodder. This was no longer just a war for survival. It was an attempt to prove to the entire galaxy that even expendable material has teeth capable of tearing out the Creator's throat. When I pressed my scorched palm against the sensor panel of the flagship's main transmitter, I wasn't thinking about anything noble. I just wanted to survive and make these celestial bastards pay for their betrayal. Using the power of the antennas that used to broadcast our noise to distract the harvest, I blasted a single signal across all frequencies, one that pierced even the spatial interference created by the Watchers. I screamed into the void on behalf of the entire Earth, on behalf of every person who had ever been left to their fate, and my voice, amplified by alien crystals, spread across the galaxy like a wildfire. It wasn't a polite request for help. It was a fierce call to everyone who, like us, had been branded a second-rate species to wake up and realize that our common masters had decided to send us to the slaughter to cover their shameful escape into the shadows. The response didn't come immediately, but when it flooded through the terminals, it took my breath away to realize just how many of us there were, those whom the arrogant Watchers considered mere background trash. The first to answer were swarms of insectoid miners from the Chronos system, creatures that for centuries had gnawed at asteroids for resources for their masters, and whom those masters planned to simply gassing like unwanted insects. Then, frequencies from synthetics on frozen moons broke through, sentient machines labeled a failed experiment, and nomads whose city fleets always huddled on the outskirts of civilized sectors. For the first time in history, such a menagerie of the rejected and the doomed gathered on a single communication channel that the very fabric of space seemed to vibrate from this collective realization of a monstrous injustice, uniting us more firmly than any official alliance. I looked at the holograms of the leaders of these unworthy races and saw in their faceted eyes and digital matrices the same thing that burned in mine, the cold resolve of beings who have nothing left to lose. We quickly realized that while the superior races were packing their bags in a panic and burning bridges behind them, we, the small and weak, had an advantage the gods had forgotten. We know how to work in the dirt and fight for every inch of space. Thus was born the Alliance of the Unworthy, a coalition of those who, by the Watchers' logic, should have humbly vanished in the silence of the cleansing protocol, leaving no trace in the annals of the universe. It was a moment of true triumph of the spirit, when yesterday's slaves and tools decided that their creators had miscalculated, and that the right to life is not granted by birthright, but is torn out with the flesh from anyone who dares to infringe upon your right to breathe. That evening, I coordinated the first joint operation to intercept the orbital destruction systems, and it felt like a pack of rats deciding to maul a leopard that had cornered them. We shared access codes, exchanged technological secrets that each of us had been quietly stealing from the Watchers for centuries, and built plans that would give any strategist of the superior races a heart attack. We were no longer scattered pieces of biological noise. We were turning into a single organism, bristling with metal and hatred, ready to sink its teeth into the throat of anyone, be it the Harvest or our former curators. Watching the first insectoid ships and human destroyers move into a common formation above Earth's burning horizon, I truly believed for the first time that if we burn, we will take the entire old hierarchy of this cursed, lying galaxy into the flames with us. When I realized we didn't have decades to study the graceful theories of the Watchers, I ordered the boys in the engineering corps to forget everything they'd been taught in the academies and pick up welding torches. We weren't going to master their philosophy of light. We were going to gut their reactors and shove that power into our old, time-tested steel boxes. This was true, dirty hacking on a cosmic scale. We took our massive railguns and, instead of ordinary slugs, loaded them with capsules of unstable antimatter extracted from the flagship's wreckage. We didn't give a damn about aesthetics or aerodynamics in a vacuum. We just welded huge Watcher engines to the hulls of our destroyers, reinforcing them with extra layers of composite armor and prayers for the endurance of the metal. We weren't creating ships. We were creating mean, radiation-spewing hammers designed to drive arrogant beings into the very fabric of space without asking physics for permission. Our first fleet looked like it had been assembled in a junkyard by mad fanatics, and honestly, there was some truth to that, because the fire of fanatical stubbornness burned in our eyes. These vessels were awkward, bristling with hundreds of cannons and torpedo tubes that protruded from the hulls at the most unthinkable angles, making the ships look like iron porcupines. Inside these monsters, it was hot, smelling of burnt plastic and sweat, and the Watchers' electronics constantly clashed with our primitive interfaces, throwing out cascades of errors that we simply ignored. We called this class of ships Wrath, and that name contained our entire attitude toward the situation. If they decided to use us as biological trash, then we would become the very trash that gets stuck in the throat of any predator. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, but they didn't account for the fact that noise can become a directed shock wave capable of stripping the hull plating off their perfect dreadnoughts. I personally inspected the main battery on the flagship Iron Fist and saw our technicians connecting fiber optic cables to the God's crystal storage units using nothing but electrical tape and the blue sparks of arc welding. It looked like sacrilege, as if barbarians were trying to fix a computer with a stone axe, but damn it, it worked, because our rage was the best catalyst for technology. We didn't try to make friends with the fallen ship's artificial intelligence. We simply broke its logic blocks, forcing it to pump energy into our primitive magnetic accelerators until the cables started glowing cherry red. The entire world around us turned into one giant forge where human recklessness forged weapons from the ruins of someone else's greatness. And in every hammer blow, there was an echo of our collective refusal to just quietly lie down and die in the dark. When this chrome and rust swarm finally tore away from the surface and began piercing the atmosphere, I felt a pride that has no place in an engineer's cold calculation, but which was impossible to silence. This was a fleet built on pure denial of inevitable doom, an armada of dead men who refused to leave until they took as many enemies with them as possible. We flew toward the Harvest and the Traitor Watchers on ships that creaked and groaned with every maneuver, but carried enough power to ignite a new star in the center of the void. Let our creators tremble in their secret corners, dousing the last lights of civilization. We are stepping out into the light at full height, and now our biological noise has turned into a deafening roar of thousands of engines going into their final and most important battle. The watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, but today, that noise will become their funeral march, performed on the glowing metal of human will. As we emerged into the Oort cloud, the icy monoliths on the periphery of our system looked like frozen ghosts in the light of distant, dying stars. The Harvest's vanguard emerged from the void not as a fleet, but as a shimmering haze of absolute darkness, swallowing space itself. My alien allies, the insectoids and synthetics, immediately began to panic over the comms. Their targeting systems were going haywire, unable to find the familiar signatures of the Watchers' shields that used to cover them like an impenetrable dome. They were used to war by the rules of the superior races, where power generators decided everything, but now, left without the protection of their gods, they felt naked under an icy rain. I stared at the tactical display, where our sensors tracked the approach of unimaginable dark matter dreadnoughts, and I knew that if we flinched now, humanity would become just another brief flash in this endless night. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, but we aren't here to hide. I barked into the microphone, ordering all Alliance ships to disable automatic safety protocols and switch to manual kinetic control. Our tactic was simple and suicidal, like a good old-fashioned bar fight. Scorched earth on a cosmic scale. We didn't try to pierce their energy cocoons with elegant beams. We just hurled millions of tons of accelerated iron and old nuclear warheads at them that should have been scrapped long ago. When the first Harvest dreadnought collided with a cascade of our dirty projectiles, space briefly turned into a blinding hell. These creatures from the void didn't expect primitive beings to use kamikaze tactics, steering drone barges packed with antimatter directly into their shimmering flanks. A kinetic impact at those speeds doesn't give a damn about the laws of higher physics. It just tore the dark matter monoliths to pieces, turning their majesty into a cloud of useless junk. The sight was truly cinematic. The enemy's giant black ships literally burst from within as our torpedoes punched through their hulls and detonated in the very heart of their power nodes. I saw one of our destroyers, engulfed in flames and losing air, ram an enemy cruiser at full speed, turning both vessels into a flower of fire blooming in the permafrost. This was the moment of truth for the entire alliance of the unworthy. We showed them what it means to fight when you have absolutely nothing to lose but your chains. The alien captains, seeing humans consciously go to their deaths to win seconds for a collective volley, began to trade their fear for rage. At that moment, we stopped being just noise for distraction. We became the most terrifying force in this sector, because an enemy that knows no fear of death had collided with those who had long since accepted their demise as a given. By the end of the battle, the Oort cloud was littered with debris that was once considered the invincible technology of the Harvest. We breathed heavily in our helmets, watching the remnants of the enemy fleet slowly retreat into the depths of the interstellar void, licking their wounds from the blows of our primitive sledgehammers. This was our first victory, and it smelled not of triumph, but of char and overheated metal. Yet it proved the main thing: gods can be wrong. While the Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, trembling in their high-tech burrows, we stood our ground where they would have preferred to simply vanish. I turned off the alarm siren and looked at my exhausted men, realizing that today we didn't just protect Earth. We gave the entire galaxy a new hope, written in blood and ash. A long war lay ahead, but now we knew for sure. If you can make a god bleed, you can kill him. As we celebrated our first victory among the icy wreckage of Oort, the last thing I expected was a stab in the back from those we had called our guardians for centuries. The space in front of our battered fleet suddenly rippled in perfect circles, and the golden needles of the Watchers' dreadnoughts emerged from the hyperspace calm, elegant, silent, and deadly. They didn't hail us. They didn't offer support. Their weapons simply began to methodically erase our destroyers from the tactical map, as if we were dirt stains on their flawless uniforms. I watched the screen as the superiors gunned down the very soldiers who had just stopped the harvest, and only one thought pulsed in my head. They aren't doing this out of hatred, but out of cowardice. To them, our resistance was just an extra decibel in that very biological noise they were so desperately trying to muffle so the monsters from the void wouldn't find the way to their secret shelters. I intercepted their general broadcast and heard a voice that sounded like metal scraping on glass. Cold, devoid of emotion, and infinitely arrogant. The Watcher commander was preaching about how our existence had become too burdensome for the galactic balance, and that we were merely rabid livestock that had imagined ourselves masters of fate. They seriously believed they had the right to shoot us just so the forest would get a little quieter while a predator passed by. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, and our refusal to die on their schedule drove them into a frenzy. We had disrupted their perfect plan of quiet survival behind others' backs. Now, I had to fight a war on two fronts, torn between the dark matter of the harvest, which had already begun regrouping on the flanks, and these golden bastards who had decided to disinfect their own farm. The order to fire on the creators came to me with surprising ease, without a shadow of a doubt, because gods who kill their children for an extra hour of sleep no longer deserve worship. My alliance of the unworthy wavered for only a moment before rage burned out the last remnants of reverence for the ancient race in their souls. We began a mad dance of death in the vacuum. Our heavy, clumsy ships maneuvered between the Watchers' gravity wells, answering their pure energy with crude lead and nuclear fire. It was the most surreal battle in history. We used the wreckage of Harvest dreadnoughts as shields against the Watchers' lasers, pitting our two main enemies against each other in a chaotic dance of annihilation. I saw through the viewport as the arrogant creators lost their formation when our dirty missiles punched through their aesthetically perfected hulls, forcing them to choke on their own pride. By the end of this nightmarish encounter, I realized that the old hierarchy of the universe was finally dead, and we were the ones who had driven the last nail into its coffin. The Watchers, realizing that savage races are capable of snapping back so hard that only melted chunks of rebar remain of their golden majesty, began to retreat into their hidden dimensions. But we weren't going to let them go. Now we knew their frequencies, their fears, and their treacherous nature. While the Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, we will be the very noise that hunts them down in any hole, because betrayal is forgiven only to the dead. I wiped the blood from my split lip and ordered the fleet to prepare for a jump into the unknown. If the gods decided to hide behind the horizon, we would simply break that horizon and drag them into the light so they could look into the eyes of those they had so carelessly condemned to death. The jump into the heart of a black hole was unlike any normal flight. It was a feeling as if your soul were being slowly stretched into an infinite string before being hurled into the underside of creation. We discovered that the Watcher's home system was hidden behind an event horizon in a pocket dimension where time flows in circles and light freezes into golden rivers. Here, in this cradle of cowardice, they had built their impossible cities out of pure meaning, while we, on the periphery, choked on dust and fought for every breath of air. While the Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, they enjoyed the absolute silence of this interstellar sanctuary, contemplating the demise of the lesser worlds like a boring play in the backyard. I stood on the bridge of my mangled ship, looking at this sterile splendor, and felt a primal urge boiling inside to just shatter this perfect mirror with a heavy work boot, reminding them of the reality they had tried so hard to forget. Our goal was the primal code, that very fundamental frequency that allowed the Watchers to remain invisible to the dark matter predators. But breaking into their main archive proved impossible for any artificial intelligence, because their defenses were built on paradoxes of higher logic that simply fried our processors. I had to disable the automation and plug my mind directly into their crystalline matrix, relying only on human intuition and that very chaos they considered our main weakness. It was a pure hack of reality. Where algorithms saw a dead end, I saw an opportunity to slip through on sheer maybe, using irrational associations and childhood memories as keys to their encrypted locks. I tore through their perfect order like a forest fire through a manicured garden, leaving behind only broken digital code and the bewilderment of their perfect guardians, who couldn't understand how this primitive brain was finding its way through the labyrinth of the gods. When I finally reached for the primal code, I realized how monstrously simple their secret was. They didn't destroy life. They simply learned to mask it as the natural background of the universe, shifting neuronal oscillations into a spectrum inaccessible to the harvest. At that moment, I felt like Prometheus, who had found a way to steal fire without getting burned and give it to those who had shivered in the dark for centuries. To steal this technology, I had to literally burn out a part of my own memory, replacing it with cascades of alien data, but I only gritted my teeth harder, understanding the price of this information. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise. But now, we ourselves would become that shadow, turning our vulnerability into the perfect camouflage that would allow us to strike when the enemy is least prepared. We were no longer bait. We were becoming invisible hunters, stealing the very right to exist from the hands of those who considered themselves the only ones worthy of life. The escape from that golden cage was like a mad race against death as the space around us began to collapse, reacting to the theft of the fundamental code. We left on full afterburners, punching through ranks of sentry drones that seemed like fragile toys compared to the rage driving us home. I watched their perfect world fade in the rearview mirrors, realizing that we hadn't just stolen technology, we had stripped the Watchers of their exceptionalism, leveling the playing field in this great game. Now we held the key to saving billions of lives, and this fire in my hands burned hotter than any antimatter, a reminder that true evolution happens not in laboratories, but in the hearts of those who refuse to die at someone else's command. We were returning to our allies, not empty-handed, but with a power capable of rewriting the very fate of the galaxy and forever ending the era where lesser races were merely expendable material in someone else's plans. When I uploaded the primal code into the Alliance network, a quiet electrical sigh rolled across the galaxy. We had finally become invisible to the radars of death, transforming from hunted prey into spectral predators. Our counteroffensive, dubbed Galactic Storm, began not with cautious sorties, but with a deafening strike against the Harvest's key nodes, stretching across thousands of light years. We were no longer playing defense. We used the gravitational fields of stars as giant lenses, focusing the energy of entire suns into narrow, blinding beams that sliced through the enemy's dreadnoughts like hot knives through butter. I stood on the bridge, coordinating the fire of 10 allied fleets, and watched the darkness of the Harvest recoil, hitting the invisible wall of our resolve. While the Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, we turned that noise into a directed symphony of destruction, making the very fabric of space shudder from our righteous fury and the new silence stolen from the gods. The scale of what was happening staggered even my battle-hardened imagination. Alien races that only yesterday trembled in their burrows were today transforming their planets into colossal battle stations, bristling with planetary-scale weaponry. The insectoids turned their asteroid belts into impregnable fortresses, and the synthetics pushed their computing power to the limit, hacking the physical shells of enemies right in the heat of battle. On every communication channel, in dozens of different languages and dialects, our human motto, "Liberty or Death," rang out, becoming the only meaning of existence for the galaxy in this war. We showed them that even a small spark can ignite a fire capable of cleansing the universe of ancient horror, and this inspiration proved more powerful than any antimatter charge. The watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, but they do not see how this noise has become a single rhythm of millions of hearts beating in unison for one single goal, final and absolute victory. In the central sectors, the battle turned into a continuous stream of fire and light, where our ghost ships suddenly emerged from the void right in the enemy's rear, sowing chaos and total annihilation. I personally led the flagship group in an attack on the Harvest's main reproductive hub, feeling the deck vibrate under my feet from the extreme G-forces of our modified engines. We used shadow jump tactics, striking and vanishing into the folds of space before the dark matter could even react to our presence. It was a war of attrition, where human cunning and alien persistence ground infinite hordes of monsters into fine dust, stripping them of their main advantage, surprise and fear. While the watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, hoping to wait out the storm in their sterile cocoons, we ourselves became that storm, tearing the shackles of the old world and building a new reality on the ruins of fallen titans. By the end of a week of active fighting, the front line stabilized, and we realized that for the first time in millions of years, the Harvest had begun to retreat, unable to oppose anything to our combined fury. The space between the stars was filled with the wreckage of enemy ships and shreds of dark matter that slowly dissolved in the radiation background of our stellar lenses. I looked at the tactical map, where the red zones of enemy presence were inexorably shrinking under the onslaught of the Alliance of the Unworthy, and felt the icy calm of a victor rising within me. We proved to everyone, friends, enemies, and cowardly gods alike, that the right to life is not a gift. It is won in the furnace of battle and sealed with the blood of those who were not afraid to challenge fate. While the watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, we are reaching the home stretch, preparing to deliver the decisive blow that will forever change the hierarchy of this galaxy and put an end to the history of our servitude. When the last Harvest dreadnought crumbled into atoms in the icy vacuum, silence fell over the galaxy for the first time in millions of years. But it was not the dead peace our creators so craved. We drove the monsters back into the intergalactic void, showing them that this territory is no longer their feeding ground, and now they will give our sector a wide berth. As for the Watchers, their time of absolute dominion ended in shameful exile to the darkest and most remote corners of the universe, where they can now fully enjoy their precious isolation. They lost their right to a voice and their golden thrones because the world they built on lies and other people's lives burned in the flames of our common war. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise. But now that noise is not the death rattle of a victim, but the confident voice of a new power that no longer needs false shepherds and bloody guardians. Humanity, contrary to many expectations, did not put on the crown of new gods, nor start building another despotic empire on the ruins of the old one. We remembered the taste of betrayal too well to turn into those we had just overthrown, and so we offered the world something entirely different, the galactic consensus. In this new structure, the status of any species stopped depending on the date of their entry into space or the complexity of their genetic code. Now, everything was decided only by the willingness to stand shoulder to shoulder and protect a neighbor in a time of need. We created an alliance based on mutual respect and the right of everyone to self-determination, where even the smallest race has a voice equal to that of the war veterans. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, unable to understand how we could unite such different beings without the use of chains and fear, simply by giving them a common goal and the belief that tomorrow belongs to them by right. I stood on the podium of the renewed council, looking through the viewports at the endless stream of ships of the most incredible designs that now navigated trade routes without any fear of the shadow. My old allies, insectoids, synthetics, and nomads sat nearby, discussing not defense plans, but projects for joint research missions into the very depths from which we once expected only death. We realized that true strength lies not in technological superiority, but in the ability to empathize and act together when clouds gather on the horizon. Our planet became the center of this new diplomacy, not because we were the smartest, but because we proved to be the most stubborn and honest in our rage. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, while we have turned that noise into the harmony of hundreds of civilizations that are no longer afraid to be heard in the icy void of vast space. I visited the crash site of that very Watcher flagship one last time, the one where this whole mad story began, changing the course of history forever. Now, those rusted titanium ribs, which once inspired sacred awe, serve as the foundation for the Starfleet Academy, where cadets from hundreds of worlds learn the art of navigation and mutual aid. I saw the children of those who until recently considered each other enemies or unworthy, running together through corridors made of ancient alien metal, unaware of how much blood was spilled for their right to simply study here. In place of the old bridge, where I once found the gods' final message, a garden has been planted, symbolizing the triumph of life over the cold logic of destruction. The Watchers hide in the shadow of our noise, but we no longer look back. We look toward the future, where each of us is our own creator and protector in this boundless ocean of stars, full of light and life.